The northeastern corner of Poland is a land of long shadows and deep roots. It is a place where the landscape itself seems to remember the weight of the centuries, characterized by vast, primeval forests and a silence so profound it feels heavy. In the unassuming town of Sokółka, life has always followed a rhythmic, predictable pulse. The residents here are people of the soil and the spirit, survivors of a history that has seen borders shift and empires crumble. At the center of this community stands the Church of Saint Anthony of Padua, a structure of white stone and twin towers that has served as the spiritual anchor for generations. To anyone passing through, Sokółka was merely a quiet stop on the road to the border, a place where the modern world's frantic pace seemed to dissolve into traditional devotion. But in the autumn of 2008, the ordinary reality of this town was interrupted by an event that would soon draw international attention and place it unexpectedly at the center of global interest. For over 2,000 years, the central mystery of the Christian faith has rested on a claim that stretches beyond the limits of ordinary explanation. This is the doctrine of the real presence, the belief that during the sacrifice of the Mass, the substance of bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ. To the casual observer, it may appear as a symbolic ritual, a sacred ceremony using simple elements of flour and water. Yet, for the billions who have knelt before the altar throughout history, it represents the deepest spiritual reality of their faith. Usually, this transformation is understood as a sacred mystery, invisible to the eye and hidden beneath the physical appearance of bread. It is an invitation to believe without seeing, to trust in a promise that leaves no measurable trace in the material world. Yet throughout history, there have been rare and deeply unsettling moments when events surrounding the Eucharist have prompted believers to reconsider the boundary between the spiritual and the physical. The account of what transpired in Sokółka is not a legend from a distant medieval age. It did not occur before the rise of modern science or contemporary medical analysis. This event unfolded in our own time, in a world shaped by high-resolution imaging, molecular biology, and careful skepticism. It began not with a grand vision or a dramatic sign, but with a simple human mistake made by a priest during a busy Sunday morning Mass. This minor accident, which should have been a footnote of the day, instead triggered a sequence of events that would eventually lead some of the most respected medical professionals in Europe to examine a sample under a microscope and acknowledge that what they were seeing did not fit easily within conventional scientific explanation. Before we can grasp the magnitude of the discovery that lay hidden in a sacristy safe, we must understand the environment in which it occurred. In Poland, the Eucharist is not merely a religious symbol. It is deeply woven into the spiritual identity of the nation. The reverence shown to the consecrated host is profound, guided by protocols that are both precise and centuries old. Every movement of the priest, every vessel used on the altar, and every fragment of the bread is handled with extraordinary care. When a host is dropped, it is not treated as discarded food, but as a sacred matter requiring a specific and respectful response. This atmosphere of meticulous devotion is essential to the story, because it ensures that every step of what followed was documented, witnessed, and approached with seriousness and caution. Picture the interior of St. Anthony's on that October morning. The air was cool. The pews were filled with families who had walked those same aisles for decades, and the liturgy was moving toward its most sacred moment. There was no indication that this Sunday would be different from any other in the Church's long history. There were no whispers of prophecy or dramatic signs. There was only a priest, a congregation, and a small white wafer that was about to fall to the floor. This single, quiet moment would eventually lead to months of careful investigation, detailed laboratory analysis, and a development that deeply moved the global Catholic community. The mystery of Sokółka presents a question to the modern mind. It is a story that begins in a silver cup and ends in a laboratory, bridging ancient theology and 21st century medical examination. As we prepare to look at the evidence, we are invited to approach it thoughtfully and without assumption. We are about to explore a case in which the expected process of decomposition did not unfold in the usual way, and where bread and water were associated with the appearance of biological material that specialists described as difficult to explain. The date was October 12, 2008. It was the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time, a day that began like any other for the community gathered at St. Anthony of Padua. The morning sun cast long, slanted rays through the windows of the church, illuminating the drifting dust and the gray stone floors that had witnessed over a century of prayer. For Father Philip Zydradowski, the priest assisting with the 8:30 am Mass, the focus was entirely on the distribution of Holy Communion. This is the moment in the Catholic liturgy where the faithful approach the altar to receive what they believe to be the living bread of heaven. The line moved with familiar solemnity. Footsteps shuffled softly on the stone, and the quiet refrain of "Body of Christ," followed by a whispered "Amen," echoed through the nave. It was in this concentrated moment of devotion that the incident occurred. As Father Zydradowski reached to place a host into the hands of a communicant, the small, thin wafer slipped from his grasp. In a church where the Eucharist is treated with deep reverence, such a moment carries unusual weight. The sound of it touching the floor, though nearly silent, would feel significant to any priest. Immediately, the established protocols of the church were followed. This was not a moment for panic, but for careful, liturgical procedure. Father Zydradowski knelt, retrieved the host from the floor, and observed that it had been soiled by the contact. According to the rubrics of the Roman Missal, a host that cannot be consumed must be treated with particular care and respect. It is neither discarded nor ignored. The standard procedure is to place the host into a vasculum, a small silver vessel filled with water kept near the tabernacle. The purpose of the water is practical. It allows the host to dissolve naturally. In Catholic theology, the sacramental presence is understood to remain as long as the physical form of bread remains. Once the bread dissolves and is no longer recognizable as such, the sacramental presence is considered to have concluded in a natural and respectful way. The resulting liquid is then poured into the sacrarium, a dedicated drain that leads directly into the earth beneath the church, rather than into the common sewer system. After the Mass, Sister Julia Dubowska, a member of the Congregation of the Eucharistic Sisters, was entrusted with the care of the vessel. Sister Julia was the parish sacristan, a woman whose life was shaped by the quiet, meticulous maintenance of sacred objects. She took the silver vasculum containing the dropped host and carried it into the sacristy. To ensure its safekeeping and to allow the dissolution process to occur undisturbed, she placed the vessel inside the heavy steel safe, where the parish's sacred vessels and oils were stored. She turned the key, and the host remained there in darkness. For the next several days, parish life continued without interruption. Families returned to their Sunday meals, weekday masses were celebrated, and the town of Sokółka carried on as usual, unaware of what rested inside the sacristy safe. For Sister Julia and the priests, it was a routine matter of liturgical procedure. They expected that within a few days, the natural process would unfold. The starch and gluten would break down, the water would grow cloudy, and the host would dissolve as it normally would. Yet, as the week progressed, the contents of the vessel did not appear to follow that expected course. While autumn advanced outside and temperatures gradually dropped, the silver cup remained undisturbed behind the locked steel door. No one witnessed the precise moment when the condition of the host began to differ from what had been anticipated. There were no cameras recording the change. There was only the silence of the safe. 7 days later, on Sunday, October 19th, Sister Julia returned. She anticipated finding a vessel of cloudy water, ready to be respectfully disposed of so the silver could be cleaned. She reached for the key, opened the safe, and lifted the lid of the vasculum. What she saw was unexpected and deeply unsettling. The host had not dissolved in the ordinary way. Instead, it displayed a development that would later prompt careful scientific examination and debate. The moment Sister Julia Dubowska lifted the lid of the silver vasculum, the stillness of the sacristy seemed to deepen. She had spent decades in service to the Church, handling sacred vessels with steady familiarity, yet what she saw inside the cup unsettled her composure. The host had not dissolved into a soft, white residue, as would normally be expected after a week submerged in water. Instead, the water remained clear, and the wafer rested at the bottom, largely intact, but with an unexpected addition. At the center of the white bread, a distinct deep red area had appeared. It was not a simple stain or surface discoloration. It was a defined, three-dimensional substance that resembled organic material. As Sister Julia leaned closer, she saw that the red area did not appear to rest loosely on the surface. Rather, it seemed integrated into the host itself, with fine reddish strands interwoven through the white structure of the bread in a way that appeared cohesive and structured. Its appearance was reminiscent of coagulated blood or biological tissue. The sacristan did not touch the vessel. She did not disturb the water or attempt to examine the host further. Instead, she stepped back, aware that what she was observing required immediate attention. She left the sacristy to find Father Stanislaw Niedzieko, the parish priest, and quietly asked him to come to the safe. She did not offer conclusions. The seriousness in her expression was enough. When Father Niedzieko entered and looked into the vessel, he responded with similar concern. As a priest, he approached the situation with faith, but also with practical caution. His first instinct was to consider natural explanations. Could it be an unusual form of mold? Could debris have entered the vessel? Yet the water remained clear, and there were no visible signs of common fungal growth. The red substance appeared fresh in color and integrated with the bread, not loosely resting upon it. The priest understood that the situation extended beyond his personal responsibility. He contacted the Archbishop of Bialystok, Edward Ozorowski, who responded with measured caution. The Archbishop instructed that the vessel be kept under careful observation. For a time, only a small number of clergy were aware of the development. They recognized how easily such events could be misunderstood or prematurely interpreted, and they wanted to document the situation thoroughly before making any public statement. On October 29, 2008, the decision was made to remove the host from the water. It was placed on a small white corporal, a linen cloth used in the liturgy, inside the private chapel of the rectory. This marked an important stage in the timeline. If the red coloration had been caused by a natural agent, such as certain strains of bacteria like Serratia marcescens, exposure to air and the absence of water would typically alter its appearance over time. However, as the host dried, the red area remained visible and became more clearly defined. It gradually assumed a darker red-brown tone, similar in appearance to dried blood, while retaining a fibrous texture. In the weeks that followed, the clergy who had access to the chapel observed the host with both reverence and caution. They noted that the red substance appeared closely integrated with the bread. There were no obvious boundaries separating the two materials. Instead, the transition between the white host and the red area appeared continuous to the naked eye. During this period of quiet documentation, the decision was made to seek independent scientific analysis. Inviting external experts was not a step taken lightly. Church authorities understood that involving secular specialists would subject the event to critical evaluation and possible skepticism. However, they considered transparency essential. To ensure objectivity, the archdiocese contacted two respected pathologists from the Medical University of Białystok, Professor Maria Sobonik-Lotowska and Professor Stanislaw Sokółka. These were experienced medical professionals whose work focused on human tissue analysis and forensic pathology. When samples were submitted to them in January 2009, the researchers were not initially informed of the origin of the material. They were simply provided with a small fragment described as organic in nature and asked to identify it using established laboratory methods and contemporary diagnostic tools. The researchers used advanced optical and electronic imaging equipment commonly found in modern forensic and medical laboratories. They conducted both light microscopy and scanning electron microscopy, which allowed them to examine the structure of the sample in significant detail. Initially, they considered whether the material might consist of starch, contamination, or microbial growth that could resemble blood in appearance. However, what they reported observing under magnification prompted further analysis. As Professor Sobonik-Lotowska examined the sample, she documented structures consistent with human cardiac muscle tissue. According to the written report, the microscopic features corresponded to myocardium, the muscular tissue that forms the wall of the human heart. The fibers displayed a complex arrangement that specialists associate with heart muscle under physiological stress. The tissue did not show the typical pattern of simple environmental decay one might expect from organic material exposed to water for an extended period. Instead, it exhibited structural characteristics described in pathology as segmentation and fragmentation. In medical literature, these features are often associated with cardiac muscle undergoing severe stress or injury. The report indicated that the observed pattern resembled myocardial tissue in a state consistent with intense strain. The researchers noted that the sample appeared to preserve structural integrity beyond what would normally be anticipated under the reported conditions. One of the most discussed aspects of the findings concerned the relationship between the tissue and the bread. Under higher magnification, the researchers examined whether there was evidence that the material had been artificially applied to the surface. According to their documentation, they did not identify a clear boundary separating the two substances. Instead, the tissue appeared closely integrated with the host material at a microscopic level, without visible signs of adhesive placement. According to the observations recorded in the report, the tissue and the bread appeared closely united. Under magnification, there was no clearly defined separation between the two materials. Professor Sobonik-Lotowska later stated that, based on her professional experience, reproducing such a connection artificially would be extremely difficult using known laboratory techniques. She noted that there was no visible evidence of adhesive substances or mechanical attachment. The report described the union as structurally continuous at the microscopic level. The researchers were confronted with findings that did not align neatly with typical expectations. The myocardial tissue identified in the sample appeared to preserve structural features despite having been submerged in water for several days and stored without conventional preservation methods. In addition, the laboratory analysis did not identify common signs of bacterial or fungal overgrowth that might normally be anticipated under such conditions. Within the controlled environment of the university laboratory, the case presented questions that extended beyond routine pathological analysis. When Professors Sobonik-Lotowska and Sokółka finalized their written conclusions, they framed them in strictly scientific terms. The report stated that the examined material was consistent with human myocardial tissue, and that the manner in which it appeared integrated with the host material did not correspond to typical patterns of contamination or surface placement. The documentation was then submitted to the Metropolitan Curia for further ecclesiastical evaluation. The Archbishop of Białystok did not immediately declare a miracle. Instead, he initiated the formal investigative procedures required under Canon Law. He established an ecclesiastical commission to examine whether any human intervention could have influenced the event. Members of the commission interviewed Sister Julia, the priests, and the sacristans. They reviewed the conditions of the safe, the vasculum, and the general security of the rectory. According to the commission's written findings, they did not identify evidence of external interference. There was no indication of forced entry, sample substitution, or access to specialized laboratory equipment within the parish that could account for the reported integration of cardiac tissue with the host material. By mid-2009, the documentation gathered from both the scientific analysis and the internal investigation had been reviewed by church authorities. On October 14, 2009, nearly a year after the initial event, the Curia of Bialystok issued an official statement. The declaration stated that the phenomenon in Sokółka was not contradictory to Catholic doctrine and that it could be regarded, from an ecclesiastical perspective, as having characteristics associated with a supernatural event. While a definitive universal declaration, such as Constat de Supernaturalitate, often involves lengthy Vatican procedures, the local decision permitted public veneration of the host. The announcement drew significant attention, both within Poland and internationally. For many Catholics, it was received as a moment of affirmation and reflection. For others, it prompted questions and skepticism. Journalists traveled to Sokółka to report on the investigation, and the parish found itself at the center of broader discussion. Some critics suggested alternative explanations, including rare forms of bacterial growth. However, church authorities pointed to the laboratory documentation, which stated that common bacterial and fungal causes had not been identified in the tested sample. Beyond the debate, what became most visible was the increase in pilgrimage. Visitors arrived from across Poland and from other countries to see the chapel where the host was displayed. For many of them, the journey was not about scientific curiosity alone, but about personal faith. The town of Sokółka gradually became known as a place of prayer and reflection connected to the reported event. In October 2011, 3 years after the reported event, a solemn procession was held to transfer the host from the rectory to the chapel of Our Lady of the Rosary within St. Anthony's Church. Large numbers of pilgrims gathered along the streets as the host, now placed within an ornate monstrance, was carried through the town. What had once been kept privately under observation was now publicly displayed for veneration. This stage of the story marked the transition from a localized investigation to wider public awareness. It reflected the care taken by church authorities to document the case before permitting devotional practices. With the formal inquiries completed at the diocesan level, attention gradually shifted from investigation to reflection on its spiritual significance. Although the events in Sokółka drew considerable attention, they were not the only reported case of this kind in church history. After the findings from the Polish pathologists became known, some researchers and theologians revisited earlier documented Eucharistic phenomena, including the well-known case of Lanciano in Italy. Observers noted similarities between the descriptions of the tissue identified in both events. According to historical accounts, in the 8th century, a monk in Lanciano experienced doubts during the celebration of Mass, and the bread and wine were reported to have taken on the appearance of flesh and blood. The material preserved in Lanciano has remained the subject of devotional and scientific interest for centuries. In the 1970s, the Vatican permitted a scientific examination led by Dr. Oddordo Linelli, a professor of anatomy and pathological histology, to analyze the preserved samples. Dr. Linelli's published findings stated that the tissue examined in Lanciano was consistent with human myocardium, meaning heart muscle tissue. The report also described structural features that, in medical terms, are associated with cardiac stress or injury. One of the most discussed details in comparative studies of these cases concerns the reported blood type. In Lanciano, the blood was identified as type AB. In other documented Eucharistic investigations, including the 1996 case in Buenos Aires, Laboratory reports also identified type AB in the tested samples. In forensic terms, blood type AB is relatively uncommon in the global population, often estimated at approximately 3 to 5% worldwide. For many observers, the recurrence of this blood type across geographically and historically separate cases has been seen as noteworthy. Supporters of these events point to the repeated identification of AB as a meaningful pattern, while critics emphasize the importance of cautious interpretation and independent verification. Those who see significance in the pattern argue that similarities in blood type and cardiac tissue findings are difficult to dismiss casually. At the same time, scientific analysis focuses on the documented laboratory data rather than theological conclusions. The reports in these cases describe tissue consistent with human myocardium and blood identified as type AB, leaving the broader interpretation to faith perspectives rather than laboratory assertion. The reported event in Sokółka has often been discussed in relation to what observers described as the interweaving of fibers. In Lączino, historical accounts describe a complete transformation of the host into tissue identified as heart muscle. In Sokółka, however, the host appeared partially intact, with the red area closely integrated into the bread at a microscopic level. Supporters of the event have suggested that this visible integration offered a distinctive point of comparison with earlier cases. Rather than appearing as a simple replacement, the tissue was described in the laboratory report as structurally continuous with the host material. For many Christian viewers, such comparisons invite reflection. They are seen not merely as historical parallels, but as reminders of how central the Eucharist is within Catholic belief. Some interpret the similarities in reported findings as a sign of unity across time and geography. In devotional language, the expression Heart of Sokółka has been used to connect the event symbolically with the Passion of Christ as understood in Christian theology. The progression from a dropped host on a stone floor to the microscopic identification of cardiac tissue naturally raises deeper questions. Why would such an event be reported in a small Polish town in the modern era? For believers, the case is often viewed not simply as a scientific curiosity, but as a spiritual sign. Within faith perspectives, it is understood as a reminder that the central claims of Christianity are meant to be lived and contemplated, not treated as abstract ideas. For contemporary believers, Sokółka has come to symbolize reassurance in a secular age. It points toward the unseen dimension of worship and the enduring importance of the Mass within Catholic life. Rather than making scientific conclusions about time or physical reality, the event is interpreted through theological reflection. In that light, the reference to cardiac tissue described in the report is often connected symbolically to the suffering of Christ in Christian teaching. The meaning ultimately rests not in laboratory terminology alone, but in the faith through which the event is understood. For many believers, the similarities noted between Lączino, Buenos Aires, and Sokółka are seen as a reflection on the unity of the faith across centuries and cultures. Rather than being understood as scientific proof, these reported patterns are interpreted within a devotional framework. The identification of type AB blood and cardiac muscle tissue in different cases has been viewed by some as symbolically meaningful. For others, it remains a subject of ongoing discussion and study. In either case, the events invite reflection on the Eucharist and its central place within Christian belief. From a faith perspective, Sokółka has also been connected to broader themes within Christianity, including the value of human life and the reality of suffering. The laboratory description of cardiac tissue under stress has often been interpreted symbolically in light of the Passion of Christ. For believers, this connection does not rest solely on medical terminology, but on theological meaning. It is seen as an invitation to contemplate the Eucharist not merely as ritual, but as a reminder of sacrifice, love, and solidarity with human suffering. As we conclude this exploration of the event in Sokółka, The image that remains is simple: a vessel placed in darkness and later opened to reveal something unexpected. Whether understood through faith or through careful scientific examination, the case continues to prompt reflection. It reminds viewers that not all questions are resolved in a laboratory, and not all meaning is confined to material explanation. Those who approach the story from a religious perspective see in it a reminder to return to reverence and contemplation. Those who approach it from a scientific standpoint may focus on the documented laboratory findings and the questions they raise. The published reports state that the examined material was consistent with human myocardial tissue, and that blood identified in certain cases was type AB. How those facts are interpreted ultimately depends on the lens through which the story is viewed. The reported integration of tissue with the bread remains, according to the laboratory documentation, difficult to explain within ordinary expectations. For the people of Sokółka, however, the meaning of the event extends far beyond scientific terminology. Their town, once quiet and largely unknown outside its region, has become associated with a story that continues to draw visitors, questions, and reflection. What happened within the walls of St. Anthony's Church is remembered not simply as an anomaly, but as a moment that invited deeper contemplation about faith, evidence, and mystery. For many residents, Sokółka will never again feel like just another point on a map. The church where generations were baptized, married, and buried now carries an additional layer of memory. Pilgrims arrive not merely out of curiosity, but seeking reassurance, hope, or a renewed sense of reverence. Some come with firm belief. Others come with questions. Still others arrive quietly, carrying private burdens, unsure of what they think, but willing to stand in the presence of something that has stirred conversation across continents. The broader discussion surrounding Sokółka does not rest on spectacle. It rests on documentation, testimony, and interpretation. The scientific reports describe material consistent with human myocardial tissue. The ecclesiastical investigation found no evidence of deliberate manipulation. Beyond those statements, interpretation diverges. For believers, the case is read within the long tradition of Eucharistic devotion. For skeptics, it remains a subject for continued scrutiny. Between those perspectives lies a space where reflection becomes possible. If one approaches the story through faith, it naturally raises a personal question. What does it mean to believe that something sacred is present in ordinary form? What does reverence look like in daily life? The event in Sokółka does not force answers. It invites them. It does not demand certainty. It encourages examination of conscience and intention. For some, it becomes a reminder that worship is not routine. For others, it becomes a reason to reconsider long-held assumptions. If the Eucharist truly holds the significance that Christian teaching assigns to it, then even the most familiar gestures within a church take on new weight. Entering a quiet sanctuary, kneeling in prayer, listening to ancient words repeated week after week, these moments shift from habit to encounter. Not because a laboratory declared it so, but because belief reshapes perception. Faith transforms the ordinary into something worthy of attention. At the same time, stories like Sokółka remind viewers that humility must accompany conviction. The Church's own process reflected caution. Investigations were conducted. Experts were consulted. Statements were issued carefully. The event was neither rushed into proclamation nor dismissed without review. That balance between reverence and examination forms part of the story itself. It shows that faith traditions, when faced with unusual claims, can choose documentation over drama. For those who stand outside the Christian tradition, the case may function differently. It may highlight the enduring power of symbols. It may demonstrate how deeply communities care about what they hold sacred. It may even serve as an example of how science and religion occasionally intersect in unexpected ways. Regardless of one's conclusion, the story invites thoughtful engagement rather than casual dismissal. Perhaps that is the most lasting aspect of Sokółka. Not a definitive answer, but a sustained question. Not a spectacle, but a summons to consider what one believes about presence, sacrifice, and meaning. The silver vessel placed in darkness became, in time, a point of light for many. Whether that light is understood spiritually or symbolically depends on the observer. As we close this exploration, we return to that quiet sacristy and the simple act that began it all. A dropped host, a careful procedure, a week of waiting, a discovery that prompted investigation. From that sequence unfolded laboratory analysis, ecclesiastical review, public discussion, and personal pilgrimage. The story moved from silence to scrutiny to reflection. Thank you for walking through this investigation with patience and openness. If the account of Sokółka encouraged you to think more deeply, to approach worship with renewed awareness, or simply to examine the intersection of faith and evidence, then it has served its purpose. Stories like this endure not because they compel agreement, but because they compel consideration. Until next time, remain attentive. Some of the most meaningful questions are not announced with noise. They emerge quietly, inviting us to look again at what we thought we already understood.